Hi, this is my review of Record of Lodoss War. This is not to be confused with the other series known as Record of Lodoss War, Chronicles of the Heroic Knight. That's a series that came 8 years later after this one. This one was brought out in 1990, and the one I'm going to review is the best series when compared to the other, in my opinion. Now, before we begin, I need to specify some things that are important to understand different aspects of this review. Well, first of all, this is going to be handled more like in a podcast format, because sometimes I don't have enough time to edit video and such, so it's going to be somewhat easier for me to record this as a podcast and add some images related to the series. And the other thing is that if you don't like anime, but that you like old school role-playing games, such as the older editions of Dungeons and Dragons and RuneQuest and such, or if you enjoy old school Renaissance games like Lamentations of the Flame Princess, Labyrinth Lord and such, you're still going to enjoy this review, in my opinion, because Record of Lodoss War has a lot to do with old school role-playing games. In fact, many of the things in the series came out from inspiration that Ryo Mizuno, the creator, and his friends experienced during their role-playing experiences, their tabletop gaming experience. So you're going to see a lot of things in Record of Lodoss War that will remind you of old school Dungeons and Dragons and such. So I think it could be worth it if you decide to stay and listen to this review. Now, let's give a little introduction as to what Record of Lodoss War is. It's probably one of the most iconic Japanese fantasy settings, in my opinion, because it first came out as a generic setting for any role-playing game system. It was the world of Pharsalia, but later on it took a bit more strength as it became more and more popular. And it based the bulk of this setting later on was it took Sword World as a platform. Sword World RPG is sort of like a Japanese version of Dungeons and Dragons, but it also takes some elements from RuneQuest. So that way, the Record of Lodoss War started to evolve and change into many things. There are different graphic novels, there's manga and video games. There's light novels as well. So there are many expressions of the Record of Lodoss War, but the thing that I like the most out of all of those multimedia expressions is the first series, the first 13 episodes. Now, I haven't looked around, but I think that these episodes can be seen somewhere on the internet, maybe here in YouTube, I'm not sure. But if you want to support the creator and get the complete series, you should look for the Record of Lodoss War complete series, episodes 1 to 13, DVD collection. I saw that there was a Blu-ray, but I've seen it. I think it's quite expensive, so you may probably decide to get the less expensive, which is the DVD collection. And it's a pretty good collection because you have many special features. You have an art gallery, cast list, different images from the comics. You also have a very nice, like a mini documentary that talks about the first screening of the first episode in a movie theater in Japan, and it's quite nice because you see those people coming out of the movie theater with tears in their eyes, and they were really excited. They were kind of like, oh, I've never seen something so beautiful, and it captured that feeling of role-playing games perfectly and such. So I recommend that you get the Record of Lodoss War DVD collection complete series. Now let's talk about some of the technical aspects of the Record of Lodoss War before we get into the bulk of the setting, so to speak. The animation is superb, top-notch, at least for that time, for the 90s. It was pretty good, because there are some anime series that they go down in quality as the series moves forward. First it starts really nice, but then you see characters drawn with their one eye at the height of the nose and the other eye almost on the forehead, so the animation quality goes down. And that happens to many anime series, but not with the Record of Lodoss War. With Record of Lodoss War, the animation quality is top notch from start to finish. And then we have the music, amazing as well. I can still hear all the different tunes every time I'm playing different, for example, Hackmaster or Labyrinth Lord and such. I still hear the music of Lodoss War when there's like an ambush. Ta-ta-tan, ta-ta-tan, ta-ra-ran, ta-ra-ran. It's really cool. Or there are other more like epic moments that something just revealed itself, like a huge plan for world domination and such, and this music starts like tan taran tan taran 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 tan taran taran taran. It's really, really amazing. So the music is beautiful, and the opening and ending sequences, I'm going to put some I'm going to search around to see if I can find them here in YouTube, and I'm going to put some links in the description below, because you need to see that opening sequence, and that ending sequence is just amazing. And the funny thing is that, well, in the DVD collection you can watch Record of Lodoss War with the original Japanese voice cast, or you could watch it with the English dub version, but I actually prefer the English dub version. And it's funny because I usually prefer the original language. For example, if I'm watching a French film, I want to see it in French with English or Spanish subtitles. But with the Record of Lodoss War, I think that the English dub fits a lot better, because, well, this is a Western fantasy setting. That is, you're going to find elves, dwarves, Western looking armor and swords and such, and you're not going to see samurai and ninja and katana and whatnot. So this is a Western fantasy, and I think the English fits a lot better because of it. There are some cheesy moments in the English dub, as there are in many the English dub anime. They don't really capture that sense of drama and action many times, but they're also, most of the time here in Record of Lodoss War, the voice actors really put their heart into it. So I recommend that you watch this using the English dub, because it's pretty good. I forgot to mention that the complete series set comes with a small booklet detailing the mythology, legends, and chronology of Lodoss. It's a very brief booklet, and you also have like a short manga, like an introductory manga that gives you more information of the characters and serves as a very small introduction to the world of the Record of Lodoss War. It isn't anything that goes out of its way as being sort of like a deluxe introduction, but it's pretty nice nonetheless. Now let's talk about the themes of the Record of Lodoss War. It's mostly a combination of romance, action, and drama. There is just a bit of comedy, but nothing that will make you fall off your chair laughing. It's just some very minor quips, or something that the character does or says that seems out of place, and the characters laugh a bit, but it's not really a comedy series. It's quite, in fact, it gets quite serious many times, and it's also somewhat melancholic even by the end of the series, because even though there are many triumphs in the story, it always feels like everything came because of a sacrifice, that a sort of like a personal sacrifice or loss had to be endured for something to be put to right, or to do good and bring justice to a particular bad situation. I must make strong emphasis that, well, many of you know that I am a reviewer of tabletop games, RPGs, and some miniature games and such. So I will be using some game terminology as I review this series. So if you hear me say things like level up or character class and such, well, I'm talking about role-playing games, and Some of the things, some of the terms also apply to video games, so that's the type of terminology that I will employ sometimes. And this review is going to have some very minor spoilers. I will avoid climactic moments and those secrets and parts of the plot that tell you just too much about all the story and the outcome. But there are some things that I will talk about of the characters and the world, so just be warned that there are some minor spoilers. Let's talk about the mythology of Record of Lodoss War first. The mythology seems to have drawn influence from different creation myths, but it's mostly, in my opinion, mostly Nordic based. That is, you have these giant and deities and mystical creatures start to come out or sprout out of that giant. And so different beings of light and dark, of creation and destruction, are sort of like separated by polarities. So you have Faris, that is the god of good, and then you have Phalaris, that is the god of darkness and evil and such. And so the gods band together into separate sides of good and evil, and they begin to fight one another. A great war begins. Now, at the climactic moment of that war, only two goddesses remain standing or flying, and those are Marfa, goddess of creation, and Cardis, goddess of destruction. And they fight, and this is like a very decisive moment of the battle, and Marfa wins. But Cardis, at the brink of death, she curses the land below her, the land where above which they are fighting that war. And that land is the island of Lodoss. So Marfa, in sort of like an improvised and desperate attempt to save the land, she separates the spot where Cardis falls over into from the rest of the land. So you have the island of Lodoss that is somewhat cursed, but then you have Marmo, and that's the spot where Cardis fell into. So she's kind of like a bit like a Cthulhu, that she falls corpse-like, dead but dreaming. And so Marmo is the most accursed part of the section closest to Lodoss. Marmo is so cursed that there are many orcs and goblins and ogres and wraiths and all sorts of horrible things. The land is so plagued with bad things and monstrous creatures that some of the characters actually practice their fighting skills, testing themselves against different monsters, and some of those monsters are actually integrated into the army of Marmo. So it is a very accursed place to live in. Now, before the main story begins, you get hints of legendary and epic conflict that happens just before the main storyline, or that section of the timeline, and they don't tell you much about it, but it's basically, there's this demon king, and this demon king, they also do not tell you exactly how he's threatening the land, but you do get the gist that a party of adventurers needed to be formed to fight against this demon king. And this party of adventurers feel really high level. If I were to put it in Dungeons and Dragons terms, they seem like level 20 and above, and they band together to fight against this demon king. The members of this party of adventurers feature quite predominantly in the background and the myth of the main storyline. Some of these members are just mentioned in a very loose way, without explaining what happened to them after that conflict, but some others are quite significant. So for example, you have Wart, which is basically a very powerful spellcaster, but he takes a neutral stance after defeating the Demon King, and he's just like in the background. He does play some major role later on, but he feels a lot like Radagast in the Lord of the Rings. And then you have Carla, which is the Grey Witch, and this is a very enigmatic character. I'm not going to say much about her because she is tied to the story and many things are related to her, many key points of the plotline, but she is incredibly powerful, and at first she seems somewhat insane, but she does have her reasons as to why she's doing things, but she could be considered one of the villains of the story. And then you have two. Well, there's a priestess that is sort of like the cleric of the group, but again, she kind of like fades into the background and she plays a very minor role. The two most prominent characters of that party that defeated the Demon King are Beld, the King of Marmo, and you have Fan, which is kind of like the good king, and they have like obviously Fan rules in Lodoss, while Beld got stuck with the rulership of Marmo, and they are quite the opposites. Even though they were great friends, and even so they are still like friends in a very loose sense, more like frenemies in the terms like Magneto and Xavier in X-Men. But it's mostly because they took different approaches or different paths after defeating the Demon King. Fan decided to rule by using diplomacy and trying to keep a peaceful kingdom, but Beld, because he rules over Marmo, he knows that his island is cursed and he wants like a bigger piece of the pie, and so he decided to embark on this conquest of Lodoss, of taking over a greater piece of the land. So in a sense, you could somewhat justify him as looking for a better opportunity for his people, but at the same time he's quite ruthless, and he's also one of like the villain of the story because of the way he is running things. So you have these two opposite forces, and even though they are following very different paths, Fan and Beld still consider themselves friends even when they face off against each other. So that's a very interesting relationship that they have. And each one of them has a very powerful magical sword, and these swords are also key throughout the story. So now we have the background of the main storyline, and let's talk about the main characters, the ones who are going to be under the spotlight most of the time. Well, first we have Parn, and Parn is the rookie, the underdog. He's a village guy who knows almost nothing about the world and about fighting, and you kind of feel a bit bad about his background, because his father, it's part of the mystery, but he left the village on a mission, and then everybody labeled him like a coward, as a coward and a traitor. They don't tell you exactly what happened, because that's part of the secrets to be revealed throughout the story, but this put a sort of like a social stigma over Parn. So everybody in the village is kind of like, oh, he's the son of that coward, or the son of the traitor, and such. And so Parn has had a very rough childhood and adolescence, and so he kind of gets into fights somewhat easily. And even though he's quite able of defeating a goblin or two and taking care of the village idiot, Parn still needs to learn a lot about fighting. And in the first episodes, he's obviously the weakest of the party members. He fails at he cannot score a hit many times. If he's lucky, he'll probably take care of an enemy or two, but most of the time he has to be rescued by the other members of the party. In fact, he's also somewhat reckless, maybe because he has that stigma of you're the son of the coward. He's always charging forward and fighting against the strongest enemies. Maybe that's also something that contributes to his image of the rookie character, because he's always facing off against the enemy boss, so to speak. And he doesn't have the skill to fight those enemies. So it gets so bad to the point that the other party members are kind of like, oh no, there he goes again, charging into battle. And even there's one time when with the wizard of the group, he's kind of like, no, don't go, wait, take me, because you're going to get attacked with spells, you need me to protect you. And so that's also part of like the charm and the comedy of the series. Later on, Parn does get a lot better. He's quite formidable, to the point that he's actually moving alone in very dangerous places and killing monsters and humans and whatever enemy comes in his path. But most of the time he gets supported by the other party members, and he does get better because he is mentored by different characters throughout the series. Now, another one, probably the two main characters of the story would be Parn and Didlit. And Didlit is an elf, the kind of like the last high elf in Lodoss. And she's pretty much in love with Parn. She's head over heels because over his, let's say, reckless and courageous attitude. Mm, she's actually 160 years old, so maybe she's into younger guys. I don't know, but she's always looking out for Parn. She's kind of like part her his bodyguard, and sometimes she acts like a babysitter because Parn always gets into the middle of things, into the thickest part of the fight, and Diddley has to take care of the monsters and maybe dark elves. She's almost like the only one who can fight against dark elves because they are incredibly skilled and agile. So I would consider Diddley to be one of the highest, the character in the party that has the highest level of experience, to put it in role playing game lingo, because she's very good at fighting up close, and she also casts some pretty useful and powerful spells. Now, the other character that always tags along with Parn is his best friend Ato, and Ato is a priest, the cleric of the group, and he serves Faris. He looks quite young and somewhat effeminate, but he's actually pretty good at close quarters with his mace. But most of the time, he's going to be healing other characters. One of the cool things is that he actually gets a cool scene where he fights alone against this incredibly huge demon, and he casts a spell that looks like the equivalent of Flame Strike, but with combined with some other type of solar spell, so that seems pretty good. But it's somewhat annoying that Ato has, let's say, a severe attitude towards Woodchuck, the thief of the group. He's always like, "Oh, Woodchuck, you got what you deserve because you're a scoundrel," and such. Now, Woodchuck is somewhat of a melancholic character because he is the thief of the group, but he was imprisoned for, I think, 15 years. I don't remember the exact time he spent in prison, but he lost his youth because of a crime that supposedly he did not commit. So he's somewhat of a melancholic character, but and also he's somewhat out of the norm of the thief you would normally see in fantasy stories. Because, well, for starters, Woodchuck, he's very unlucky. He's probably the unluckiest of all the party members. And that's funny because in role-playing games and other fantasy stories, thieves are usually quite lucky. They have this supernatural knack to get out of trouble. But Woodchuck is not like that. And Woodchuck, for a thief, he's quite huge, quite burly. He's looks very strong, and sometimes he does carry out a thief-like attacks and maneuvers, like throwing daggers and sneaking around, but he's quite capable of holding his own and on open combat up close and personal. There is actually a scene where there's a war and he's one of the frontline fighters, so he's a very interesting character. There are two other characters that also seem like the strongest party members, and one of them is Gim, and he's a dwarf, and you can obviously see that they took inspiration from Gimli. So he is quite skilled and strong with an axe, and he's sort of like on a personal mission to rescue this person that went missing. I can't speak too much about it because, again, it's very much related to the plotline, but that's his driving force. And he's also serves like a sort of like one of the members that formed the party, because it was because of this mission that he started gathering people around. And the other character is Slain, and this is probably one of the most badass wizard characters you will ever see in fantasy. This wizard is incredibly powerful and has some very manly moments, and at times, so for example, he has a lot of Gandalf like moments where there's some great threat or a group of monsters and he's kind of like, "I'll handle this, you go on ahead," and he faces off alone against these monsters. And it feels like he gains experience at an alarming rate, because during the first episodes he is a good spellcaster, but he doesn't seem that powerful. He has like a spell or two and then he's exhausted, like, "Ugh, I'm dying of casting the spell." But in a few episodes he's capable of, he feels like a one-man party at times, and he's able to hold his own at least for a good while against the strongest characters in this entire series, even supernatural beings. So he's one of the most powerful characters. And as to his manly moments, there's a moment where one of the female members is captured by a monster, and he unleashes a spell and releases her and catches her with one arm, and with the other arm threatens the monster with his scepter, and he's kind of like, again, you guys go on ahead, I'll take care of this monster. So he's a very cool character, probably one of my favorites. Now, there are some other important characters in the series. So, for example, on the good guy side, we have King Cashew, and King Cashew is amazing. He's very powerful, probably one of the most skilled fighters in the group. You simply cannot see this guy being outclassed by another enemy, and he is the king of Flame, a desert kingdom, and he supposedly was a gladiator, and he fought his way up to the crown, and he's a very exceptional character, and Parn looks up to him. And one of the things that I like is that, if you remember that I said that Parn was mentored by different characters in the series, King Cashew is the best mentor in my opinion. He really takes him under his wing, and even though he's quite severe with him, sort of like a tough love kind of way, he always tells him what he's doing wrong. So, for example, when he's sparring with Parn, he's always like, no, don't use the strength of your shoulders, use the strength of your hips, and like that. And well, the other mentors don't do as good as of a job training him. And he trains Parn so well that there will come a time when they are standing back to back in different battles. And it's a very interesting relationship between the two. King Cashew is kind of like the father that Parn never knew. And they make an excellent team later on. And on the good side, on the good guys' side, you also have Orson, which I think was a major disappointment because he's such a cool character and they didn't know how to use him. So, because he's a berserker, he has the ability of getting possessed by the spirit of war, Yuri, and he enters this psychotic rage where he starts killing everyone, even though he has hundreds of wounds on his body. And they didn't take advantage of that. He just appears later on in the series and presents a bit of an obstacle for the party, but when he is actually fighting against enemies, he never rages. Maybe he does out of camera, in a way of speaking, but you never see him enter this rage against the monster, so that is such a waste. And you also have Sherry's, that is kind of like mercenary soldier of fortune type of girl, but even though she is skilled with fighting with a blade and many other things, she seems somewhat pointless. She's basically just there to form a love triangle between her, Parn, and Didlit, but it never really gains momentum. And one critical thing that she does in the story could have been done by any of the other characters. So Orson and Sherry's are quite underplayed in my opinion. On the bad guy side, there are three important bad guys, in a way of speaking. Some of them could be considered anti-heroes, but they're mostly villains. First, you have Vagnard, and Vagnard is a very interesting character and somewhat complex. He seems to be almost like a vizier in his role of advisor towards Beld, and you know that he is a powerful spellcaster, but at first he doesn't seem to be that much of a big deal, but as the series progresses, you're going to be surprised by the type of character that he is. And you also have Ashram, and Ashram is also a very complex character, because at first he seems like the typical Black Knight, that he is like the mirror opposite of Parn, because when Parn is good and kind, Ashram is severe and stern, and because Parn is generally unskilled in the use of swords, Ashram is obviously that he has been training to fight from a very young age. And also, it seems like the level of skills between Parn and Ashram is quite different, to the point that Ashram seems more like an even match for King Cashew and for Parn, even though they will eventually face off sometimes. And in my opinion, they handle those encounters quite realistically within the fantasy context. That is, there is a reason as to why they stop fighting at times, and you don't feel like they just stop that fight so that the characters would stay alive throughout the series. But no, there are some reasons as to why they are interrupted in their battles, and you always feel like someone is going to die when they fight. That's pretty cool. And Ashram has a dark elf lover slash servant, which is Pyrotes. And Pyrotes is sort of like the opposite of Didlit. Pyrotes is a dark elf, and she protects and is crazy about Ashram. So they feel like mirror images. When Parn fights Ashram, Didlit fights Pyrotes, and it's somewhat of a mirror match. It's quite exciting at times to see. Now let's talk about the series, about how it progresses and the things that you will experience. Well, the first episode is it's pretty good. It's probably one of the most exciting fantasy episodes I've seen in my life, because it's sort of like a prologue to the entire series, but then you get thrown into the middle of the action. You see the main party of adventurers. You don't know what's going on, but you can pretty much tell that they're in the middle of a very important mission, and all of the characters are going to shine, because this first episode is sort of like a dungeon crawl. It's going to be completely Dungeons and Dragons themed. You see the characters entering these ruins and triggering traps and getting attacked by monsters. They even fight a huge dragon by the end of that episode, and all of the characters show their special abilities. The only one that was somewhat underplayed was Ato, which basically does nothing. He just says a few things to make the party members feel better, or to keep them together, because Didlit and Gim are, because they are, it's a dwarf and an elf, so they're going to be, dwarves are like this and that, and elves are like this and that, and they keep attacking each other, sending some jabs each other's way, although they recognize their own strengths as well. So even though Gim attacks Didlit, he's going to be like, don't worry, the elf is with him, he's going to be fine. Or Didlit is kind of like, Gim is pretty good at a fight, so there's no problem. So even though that there's sort of like a racial dislike between each other, they still recognize what the other is good at. And during that first episode, you get pulled into the series. It's incredible. It's quite amazing. And later on, you get information on how the group came together, and you see how their different objectives kind of like meshed together, and Parn and Didlit and Ato teamed up with Slane and Gim, and later on Woodchuck becomes part of the team. But Woodchuck is mostly in it for the money, because he's a thief. He's looking to see if there's some riches in it for him. And Gim is driven by his quest of finding this missing person. Slane seems to be there just to fight evil and the wrongs in the world. Gim tells him, like, your talents are being wasted by just remaining passive, living in the forest. And so Slane travels forth. And Ato, well, he is a priest of Fari, so he's kind of like required to fight this darkness in the world. And Parn wants to become a knight to serve King Fan like his father did before him, and to find out the truth about why his father was labeled a traitor and a coward. The reveal is actually quite cool, and Didlit also is kind of like just tagging along to protect Parn. She really becomes crazy in love with him. And so that's how the way the series moves forward. And it has many role-playing game moments, because, well, first of all, not all of the party members will survive the entire story, and some other party members will join. So it kind of feels like when in Dungeons and Dragons you get your character killed. That is in the older editions, because in the most recent editions it's quite difficult for you to die. But in the older editions it was quite common for you to lose your character to a trap or a monster. And then when in the series of Record of Lodoss War, when another character appears, it feels like you just generated a new character. You took a new sheet and you created a new character, so that's quite nice. And there are many, like a good variety of situations and scenarios. Although I would have liked to have seen a more dungeon crawl type of scenes, because there aren't that many dungeons and ruins in the story. There you also have scenes of traveling in the wilderness and wars. There is a huge open war that it feels quite exciting and lethal, and that reminds you of old school games such as like I forgot about the name. I think it was Birthright. You know, that version of Dungeons and Dragons, or some of the more recent old school Renaissance games where they handle warfare, like Astonishing Swordsmen and Sorcerers of Hyperborea, or Scarlet Heroes and such. You do get that sense of something happening on a bigger scale. So that really helps the series in terms of variety. The only thing that I didn't like too much about the series is that by the end of it, that is in the last 4 or 5 episodes, you feel a bit like things were rushed. Like they were like, oh no, how are we going to close this series? And they sort of like bring this let's say climactic element out of nowhere. It does make sense with the mythology of the story and with the setup of the characters that are still alive by then, but the way it was pulled out of nowhere with no like a few more hints about it in the first episodes would have prepared you for it, but it otherwise feels like sort of like a Deus Ex Machina element to close the series, to bring the series to completion. And in to be fair, the series handles that climax or conclusion quite nice, even though, as I told you, it has that feeling of being rushed. But so overall, it does feel like a complete series. There's a few loose ends, just very little things that you think they should have brought those things to closure. But in general, the series concludes. It's quite satisfactory, but it still has that sense of melancholy. The series is colored by deaths and destruction and sacrifices and things that shouldn't have happened in perhaps in your opinion, as you get attached to the different characters. So even though that's there's an exciting conclusion to the series, there's still that sense of sadness and melancholy. Well, let me tell you what I think in general of the record of Lodoss War. This is one of the best anime series, and or even one of the best series in general that I have seen in my life. I have yet to see a fantasy series that surpasses this one. It's just such an epic story, and it has so many moments that feel like it almost feels like a cosmic battle that is being carried out in Lodoss. Like these characters aren't just people trying to survive a conflict. They feel like crucial pieces in a cosmic game of good versus evil. And the way all the characters relate to one another and their interactions, it's pretty well done. And what I like the most about this series, as I was telling you, is that it has that old school feel. You won't see characters performing crazy special attacks and moves. Like, for example, if a fighter is suddenly cutting away with a sword that shines like a laser sword or fire, is because that sword is magical or someone cast a spell upon that sword. He's not going to pull that power out of nowhere. In fact, I think in general the series is quite gritty. And those, I would consider it, even though there are some high fantasy moments, I would consider it low magic at times. Not all the time, but at times. To put it in a way, it feels a bit like Lamentations of the Flame Princess, in that magic is there, but it's somewhat downplayed or saved for crucial moments. That is, you won't be seeing wizards unless they are very powerful, supernatural linked wizards, so to speak. You won't see them casting fireballs like there is no tomorrow. But there are characters that are quite strong. So I would recommend that you watch this series immediately, because especially if you like role-playing games and if you like fantasy, this is one of the best fantasy series out there. And I have yet to see, as I was telling you, a modern fantasy series that matches it in terms of quality and character development. And considering back then animation had a very different standards than from today, it's even this series still feels like the best of its genre. Well, thanks for watching my review or hearing my review. If you have any comments or questions, please let me know. See you later.